This channel will normally center around movies, so when I cover video games like this, I'll be doing so in a way that is intentionally accessible to those who don't have a deep relationship to the medium. And as such, this is less about the poker-themed game Balatro and more about how I can use it to articulate my relationship to healthy and unhealthy habits, as well as how I differentiate between the two. I get pretty personal with this, but this is with the intention of making other people feel less alone. And while it's always validating to be listened to and know that what I say is of interest to others, this isn't some cry for help. I'm very happy. I just find it most interesting to write about some heavy shit right now. I have logged nearly 100 hours in this game over the past 3 months. When I first downloaded it, I had a vague sense that its popularity had something to do with narrative depth, kind of like Inscription, but I was completely mistaken. Balatro's depth, aside from a few clever references on its cards, is purely in its mechanical satisfaction and game design, something so perfectly engineered to hammer the brain's reward centers. In Balatro, you score points with traditional poker plays, pairs, flushes, full houses, and such. Similar to how Texas Hold'em allows you to make any 5-card combo of the 7 pocket and community cards, in Balatro you assemble your plays from an 8-card hand. You're also given a budget of discards to roll the dice on maybe getting a better hand down the road. You get to play a number of hands until you either hit the required score for a round or run out of hands and have to restart a run. Between rounds, you can spend in-game, non-microtransaction currency on upgrades, like modifying your 52-card deck to increase the probability of certain hand types, applying bonuses to some cards, upgrading the points afforded by a certain hand type with planet cards, or filling one of 5 Joker slots with an even greater range of playstyle possibilities. You just keep optimizing to get past larger and larger hurdles until eventually you set up one last hand, and as it starts ringing up points, it doesn't quite clear where it needs to, and then you start all over from the beginning again. I'll cut myself off there because I expect either people watching understand that game from playing it, or that explainer and what's on screen makes you understand how frustratingly addicting the game might be. Right now, when I'm in a bad mood for enough time that I don't want to concentrate on other things, I hungrily reach for my Steam Deck and fire up Balatro. Years from now, I'll never talk about these 30 to 60 minute play sessions. They will blend together in my brain. They won't stick with me as other video game memories have. Defeating Arpeggio in Sly Cooper 2, losing Jack and Tally on Mass Effect 2's Suicide Mission, watching the different possible futures fractalize at the end of BioShock Infinite, entering the abattoir in Pathologic 2, motivating a dance party in an abandoned church in Disco Elysium, or finally finding a combination of bleed weapons and bleed summons that allowed me to destroy the last boss of Shadow of the Erdtree. Those are all moments I, with some embarrassment, cherish, even if they were all just me sitting on the couch or in bed. I doubt any of my time with Balatro will exist for me as anything but a sludge of self-soothing. But I'm also so glad that Balatro is the most self-destructive thing in my life at the moment. My most damaging vices have historically been entertainment media, social media, and illicit substances. Of those, I can say the first is the most complicated. I find a lot of value in movies, TV, and video games. Even the most corporate and cynical of each had people that cared about their craft contributing their creative touch, and it's something that ties people together. It is one of my greatest passions in life, which has made it so hard to parse when passion and connection of my life to the creation of another human being becomes an escape away from having to consider my own person at all. But the latter two have become increasingly clear to me. It's not that I don't have good memories of being drunk or high with friends that I wouldn't wish away, or that social media hasn't kept me in touch with people I love that would have slipped out of my life were we not constantly aware of each other's existence. But the diminished role both play in my life is something I can't regard with anything but thanks. Social media fell out of my life pretty unintentionally. I got into Facebook fairly young and used it frequently as a public diary throughout my teenage years and adulthood. I never really made the jump to Instagram that most people my age did, but I did experience the transformation of Facebook into AI garbage and constant alerts begging me to care about comment conversations I never had any part in. I did develop an addiction to Twitter later than most in 2019 that both kept me keyed into a lot of world updates and enjoyable humor, but I found the strength to leave when the idea of sharing any of my information or opinions directly onto a government-associated app struck me as scary. Luckily, Blue Sky has been a pro-social substitute, both with its lack of advertising incentives thus far to spur engagement and saturation with liberals reacting to every individual quirk of our rising fascist movement in such a way that evidences no lessons learned over the last 10 years. I kind of surprised myself when I realized a few months ago that the behavior of reaching for my phone for that dopamine drip from an infinite scroll had all but disappeared. Reducing the role of substances has been a lot more intentional. I was watching The Outrun a few months ago where there's this AA meeting in which a member says that the only requirement for entry is a desire to stop drinking. Alcoholic is a hard label to apply for myself, both from the stigma and for the feeling of some form of behavioral imposter syndrome, like I don't deserve to apply that to me. I have never been a daily drinker, but the voice of moderation in my head passes out very early, and drinking has often been what I reach for when everything else fails to self-soothe or sabotage. And while I enjoy it in a regular craft beer or glass of red wine for its taste, alcohol as a delicious treat never fully supplanted alcohol as the liquid cure to anxiety and depression. So while I have never signed a lease with alcoholism, it has been a regular house guest to an extent that I've questioned whether I should start charging rent. Nearing 1 year, I'm in the middle of my longest period of adult sobriety that also included an abstention from cannabis. I continue to be passionate that substance's criminalization has done exponentially more damage than its use, but in a world that rejects reefer badness, we must acknowledge that in many, many cases, what seems like a harmless habit can be anything but. To condense a really complex school of research, the concept of allostatic balance describes a process by which our body attempts to restore itself to a certain standard of functioning for survival. What if you're attacked by a predator in the middle of the night? Your body will start releasing adrenaline to keep you alert when any other day you would be sleeping. The same is true of any substance where the body will try and return itself to a certain level of functioning. With weed, if you are constantly dulling your alertness, it's very likely your body could be compensating with other chemicals. Now, of course, research on this is nowhere near where we'd want it to be because of prohibition, but there are several studies out there that show that cannabis users can report higher levels of stress and irritability from a drug that's infamous for having a chilling effect, maybe because the body increasingly adapts to pushing in the opposite direction. The absence of the cold sweats associated with opiate use or the life-threatening possibilities of alcohol withdrawal says less about weed being fundamentally non-addictive and more about imperfect definitions of addiction itself. Drug use is so inseparable from judgment in our culture, but I know that the times in which I used marijuana the most regularly did not serve me well. And as someone with a bachelor's degree in psychology with a huge focus in substance use and neuroscience, I had no professor who did not speak with an enormous amount of caution about the use of the substance, as the body of research is both thin and unencouraging with what is there. Guilt is not an emotion I find terribly useful in what we do for our own health, so I would rather encourage curiosity about the ways substance use affects your life that you might not have considered, especially if the words I've been saying triggered some kind of sinking or even angry feeling. You know yourself better than me. But for me, challenging my own stubborn habits helped a lot. However, I haven't eradicated any of these vice categories in my life. At 27, I've finally willingly entered into an addiction with caffeine. Grinding coffee beans and using my Chemex, another example of simple, elegant design like Balatro, gets me out of bed in the morning. My doctor had recommended ADHD medication, and coffee feels like a more fun way to meet that need without needing to go to extra doctor's appointments or become dependent on a substance that's constantly going in and out of shortages. There's also the 2 antidepressants I'm on, both of which radically change how my brain operates. And in the long term, building up in my system rather than being identifiable short-term effects like fast-acting amphetamines, benzodiazepines, or alcohol. There's somewhere that nagging feeling that I don't really know who I am because of antidepressant effects. Of course, then I'm also still consuming media, social or narrative, that brings me some kind of reward. I don't have an endless social media feed nearly as much as I've had for the last decade or so, but I check my YouTube engagement stats pretty compulsively. And as far as entertainment goes, I watch a movie pretty much every day in those last few hours before going to bed. And of course, there's my Balatro habit. Teasing out the difference between good and bad habits is hard. A frustrating quirk of mental illness is how nebulous it can be. The DSM-5 definition of major depressive disorder is characterized by having a 2-week or more period in which one experiences at least 5 of a total of 9 possible symptoms, which means 2 different people could be diagnosed with the same condition while only sharing 1 symptom. As you study abnormal psychology more and more, mental illnesses crystallize conceptually less like physical illnesses with specific viral and bacterial strains or the presence or absence of a tumor, and instead as a collection of co-occurring behavioral patterns that have historically tended to be treated by the same methods. A lot of work in definitions is done by the phrase causes clinically significant stress or impairment. That will always, to some extent, be unique for each person. However, even if not a commandment on a slab of stone, it's a valuable path to walk down in discerning what behaviors I find helpful, suboptimal, or completely unacceptable. Alcohol use when out of control, either in acute episodes or in prolonged activity, is very dangerous. Even the occasional binge drinking episode has left me with stories that might be amusing in isolation, but cumulatively are alarming and are dice I'd rather stop rolling. My worst experiences with weed have been an attempt to help myself sleep, and in doing so, avoid boredom, or more specifically, being alone with negative thoughts that I didn't have the faculty to work through. It's putting off the process of even having the reflections that would get out of a funk and instead trying to obliterate the self, good and bad, to avoid the latter. I am nervous about my new adoption of coffee in some way. Without any history of use, my tolerance is minimal, and I feel a palpable rush at the use of a stimulant. For better or worse, one of the highlights of my day is taking what I consider to be a drug. But at least for now, I can make some peace with that. When I get up in the morning, I am excited to make myself a little treat, rather than resenting having to return from dreams to my daily life. While I fear chemical hooks, I struggle to resent being excited to be alive in the morning. It feels worlds away from dulling my mind in the evenings to escape the fact I must return to the reality of the next day. In college, I wrote a research paper on caffeine, which generally identified 2 trends in research. Experiments, studies in which participants are assigned different levels of caffeine use, tended to identify negative effects of coffee on conditions ranging from anxiety to hypertension. Seeming to contradict that, correlational research, which simply asked people about their habits after the fact without direct intervention, found generally more favorable mental and physical health among those who drank coffee or otherwise used caffeine than abstainers. Now, looking at anything at this level can have confounding variables, such as people with certain mental health conditions self-selecting away from caffeine use. But it stuck with me from the research that the habits that caffeine fits with, routine, stable work, a little bit of enjoyment, may outweigh the negatives caused by the chemical substance itself. I held a resentment at the time that a stimulant that wires humans for capitalistic productivity was afforded more social acceptance by our society than those meant for hedonistic joy. But that opinion has eroded as I've acknowledged the positivity coffee has brought into my life over recent months is worlds more valuable to me than any time I spent stoned giggling at children's cartoons. And antidepressants, while in their own way life-altering, make me feel good, as I never have before. I'm in an odd space with these where I have a lot of fear of the cavalier way that some prescribers can throw them around, while also rolling my eyes at many blanket statements made about them by often anti-pharma detractors. In a large population, there is a trend towards positive effects from taking antidepressants, but for an individual, a really bad experience with them can be disastrous. Doctors can casually prescribe something that works wonders in the majority even of their patients, but for that minority, it's psyche destroying. Seeing people as full humans is essential. Pills don't teach skills is a useful phrase I was taught, and I think prescription with work with somebody client trusts guests who's regularly checking in with them as a full human being works wonders while being less immediately profitable than controlled resources like pharmaceuticals. Psychotherapy in tandem with medication is, from what I understand, the most research-backed approach to a lot of common mental health conditions, and anecdotally, it's what worked for me. I am happier and feel more present than I did when I was depressed without medication, and I refuse to accept that the constant depressed and anxious version of myself was somehow more me than the person I am right now. Whatever might have been natural in the past centuries is not our current world, and while obviously large-scale societal change is important, I think that stuff that makes us not hate ourselves in the way our world encourages by manifesting needs to fill through advertising and consumption isn't unnatural or counter-revolutionary in any particularly unique way, but a useful tool to stay healthy in this modern world. I certainly wasn't making the world a better place, self-isolating, depressed, and angrily posting online. And on that subject, losing social media obviously wasn't completely neatly positive. I developed a dependency on it to get my news, and cutting it out immediately, I became a lot less informed. But I've enjoyed more intentionally rebuilding that information stream by finding a couple Substacks I enjoy reading and listening to Democracy Now's daily information overview each morning. It feels nice to intentionally engage with learning about the world as opposed to the slurry of irreverent humor, life updates, and the most appalling atrocities on Earth in the same information feed. And I think avoiding that has nothing to do with putting my head in the sand and everything to do with taking ownership over how I want to position myself in the world. And what I do on YouTube is creative, it's fun. I wish I meditated when I desired my phone and looked at the statistics of how many people were watching my videos, but in the grand scheme of things I could do that are destructive to my own well-being, that's one that isn't the worst thing on earth. I set my goals with this channel achievably low, so it's all joy that anyone else out there is getting something from the stuff I'm creating, rather than disappointment that it's not becoming a career out of nowhere. And then there's Balatro. Video games have solidified themselves for me as mostly a vice. They're a thing I reach for when I'm at my worst right now. During the pandemic, I think they helped me avoid a lot of the alcohol use increases that happened for people around my generation. And I think they continue to be pretty useful for me in similar ways right now. One day, I'm gonna have a bad week, and I'll have Baldur's Gate 3 or Avowed or some other game I've been putting off to play. It's not gonna be the best thing on earth to do, but it's something that I like and has some degree of lasting impression on me. Even my beloved Balatro, on the most superficial end of that spectrum, probably the part of my life I'm least proud of right now, still feels like a victory. Because after having so many bad habits over the course of my life, it's such a relief that all it takes for me is 30 to 60 minutes of my time each day, and I can live with that. Thanks for watching.